a secret group said to comprise of the world's most powerful people seeking to establish a new world order.
Pentagrams, goats, even the all-seeing eye that's found on US banknotes.
Well, we're back. We all know you love the conspiracy theories.
Yeah. And we've got some that are actually real. It's not like the, birds aren't real. But the jury's still out on that. Starting off our list today with the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. Back in the 1930s, Americans had a sneaking suspicion that their government was partaking in some less than ethical medical experimentation on men of color. At the time, those who believed the suspicions were called crazy, but as it turns out, they were actually right. In 1932, the United States Public Health Service worked side by side with the Tuskegee Institute to create a fake syphilis treatment program for black men, in which unethical experimental practices were used to determine the different effects of syphilis on the human body. For 40 years, 400 men were given dangerous chemicals and unnecessary medical procedures being passed off as legitimate treatment methods, even after penicillin was determined to cure the ailment. In 1974, the practices of the United States Public Health Service were revealed and a class action lawsuit was brought about. In the end, the suit was settled out of court for $10 million and a lifetime of health benefits being awarded to the surviving participants of the experiment.
There are real facilities in places all over the world, mostly in the United States, where problem youth are taken to. These places are referred to as behavior modification facilities. The thing is, some of the stuff that goes on in these places is just plain illegal, but it's all hidden behind a guise of positivity and growth. In reality, some of these places are worse than jail. Former quote-unquote students have come out of these places with really disturbing stories of the suffering they went through in places like Ivy Ridge, which was the subject of a recent Netflix documentary. Here, students weren't allowed to speak, they constantly had to walk in single file, they weren't allowed to look out the window. They were under constant, highly strict supervision and had this gigantic list of just insane rules that they had to adhere to. So long and ridiculous was this list, it was just impossible to keep track of what was allowed and what wasn't. I mean, really, you can't look out the window? If a rule was broken, by the way, they'd lose points, keeping them trapped in the program for longer. They'd have to rack up a certain number of points in order to make it up throughout levels and eventually leave. Some would be trapped in the facility for years. All their letters to their parents, by the way, were monitored, and if they spoke badly of the program, they'd lose more points. Beatings were also common, especially in the boys section of the facility. There are still said to be places like this operating today. All the stuff I just mentioned was happening in the mid-2000s. It's just very, very disturbing.
Next up, we have the conspiracy theory that the government secretly funded the Tibetan Resistance against China and paid an impressive 7-figure salary to the Dalai Lama during the same time period. Well, obviously it's on this list, so the theory was correct. Over the course of several years, the United States actually paid the Dalai Lama $180 million in an effort to aid the Tibetan Resistance. In a declassified document, the organization responsible for overseeing the payments said that the purpose of the program was to keep the political concept of an autonomous Tibet alive, both within Tibet and among foreign nations, mainly India, in order to build capability for resistance against possible political developments inside of communist China.
Here's one that really shouldn't come as much of a shock. The government is tracking you online. I know. Wild. So we all kind of know this happens already, but it's the extent we're not too sure about. We know that our search history and stuff is sold to companies. That's why you'll get ads popping up that are just a little too specific to be coincidental, but the government has its eyes on us as well. In 2016, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, or the EFF, which is an organization that sets out to defend civil liberties in the digital realm, well, they reported that various government agencies sent out tons of requests to various websites for user data. They sent 49,868 requests to Facebook, 85% of which were granted, by the way. 27,850 requests were sent to Google, 9,076 to Apple. As for what they're doing with all that stuff, who knows, but it's definitely unsettling. Real privacy is hard to come by these days.
Next up, we have the theory that society's elites have banded together to form some kind of secret society that consists of yearly gatherings and strange rituals worshipping some kind of giant stone owl creature. Well, believe it or not, this is true, but it's not the Illuminati. More on that later, of course. It's actually the men of the Bohemian Grove Club, which was formed in 1872. Each year, members of the club, aka the rich and powerful elites of the world, come together for a 2-week retreat in California, during which time they spend their time enjoying the outdoors, listening to music, and taking in the theater. Oh, and paying their respects to the club's mascot, a giant stone owl. Confirmed members of the club have included both Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, who attended the retreat just prior to their presidencies. The Bohemian Club is also where the idea for the atomic bomb was first conceptualized back in 1942. For this one, I kind of feel like it's a you get what you get kind of situation in terms of information. I mean, they admitted to coming up with the idea for the world's most destructive weapon there, so I'm guessing there's a lot more routine happenings than just enjoying the sunshine and letting loose, but I doubt we'll ever know.
During Woodrow Wilson's presidency, there was a time where some were starting to wonder if someone else was pulling the strings, a secret president behind the scenes, and it turns out there kinda was. His wife, Edith Wilson, who some do refer to as the first female president of the United States, just not officially. President Wilson had suffered a stroke that left him unable to carry out his duties, but the government chose to keep the extent of his condition hidden from the public. During the months following the stroke, Edith Wilson assumed a more active role in the decision-making within the White House, but she claimed to act only as a steward of her husband's presidency. There were conspiracy theories that Edith Wilson was secretly running the country while her husband was incapacitated, and it turns out she actually did take on the responsibilities of the president for over a year.
Next up, we have the conspiracy theory that big tobacco products not only caused cancer, but also that the companies producing the products knew that fact and hid the paperwork proving the negative health effects from the public in order to boost sales. I mean, this one seems pretty obvious, but at one time someone might have actually called you crazy for speaking the phrases, "I don't trust big tobacco," or "tobacco companies know their products aren't safe" out loud. And that is because for decades tobacco companies buried evidence proving that smoking is deadly. And not only that, but they somehow managed to convince the world that they were actually good for you, to the point where doctors used to prescribe cigarettes. In fact, it wasn't until the late 1990s that Philip Morris, founder of a major tobacco company, you can probably guess which one, finally admitted the truth about the negative effects of tobacco use. And yes, there are many.
Is there a real cabal responsible for pulling the strings behind stolen spy software, money laundering, arms dealing, and even the Iran-Contra affair? A journalist named Danny Casolaro thought so. He referred to them as the octopus, and just before he was about to crack the case in 1991, he was found dead in a hotel room in West Virginia. It was immediately ruled that he had taken his own life, but it's pretty clear that that wasn't what happened. Casolaro had been digging into a case brought to him by a software company called Inslaw, who had claimed their software had been stolen and sold off without their consent. As Casolaro dug deeper and deeper into the case, he started unraveling this wide-reaching conspiracy involving politicians, former CIA officers, and other shady characters. Casolaro even told his brother that he'd started receiving death threats just weeks before he was found dead. And when he was found dead in the hotel bathtub, he had 12 deep slash wounds on his wrists, slashes that would have been impossible to inflict on his own. And all his research was missing. Danny Casolaro's family think he was killed, and so do a lot of people.
people. Next up, of course, we have the theory that this country, that country, and all the other countries are all run by a secret organization of society's most affluent and influential members. The organization controls the media, major financial institutions, international conflict, and all international and domestic policies, and pretty much anything else you can think of. Oh, and they might worship the devil, and they call themselves the Illuminati. While I can't necessarily prove this conspiracy theory to you today, what I can do is tell you about a very strange coincidence I recently discovered that I don't actually think is that much of a coincidence. You know the NSA, the National Security Agency of America? Well, if you were to open up your computer, open up a web browser, and then type Illuminati backwards into the search bar and then .com, that's ITANIMULLI.com, the official NSA government website comes up. I'm not joking. If you don't believe me, feel free to try it out for yourself, but just remember, they're always watching.
At one time in history, people in the Western world were shocked to learn that the big hairy monsters they'd only heard about in myths and legends actually turned out to exist. It's kind of hard to believe it, but gorillas were considered cryptids at one point, at least in the West. We didn't know they really existed until 1847 when bones were found in Liberia. In the grand scheme of things, that's really not that long ago. Photography had been invented over 20 years before. Imagine hearing stories about big, hairy, humanoid-looking creatures with 10 times the strength of humans. You'd think they were monsters. It would be like seeing an actual Bigfoot carcass and learning that they really are families of Sasquatch roaming through the forests in the US and Canada. It's just kind of crazy to think about. Well, we're gonna shout out a couple of your comments, your lovely comments.
You guys are so good to us.
This one is from Fruity Dookies. I do not like this guy, and he does all the good top 10s. Sad face. Well, you know what, Fruity Dookies? I don't like you either, and that's why I hacked into your computer. I found everything that you love and hold dear, and every time a video comes up of something you're interested in, I raise my hand and go, I'm doing that one. And that's gonna be your future.
You did it to yourself, Fruity Dookies. Next up, we have a comment from ELXABER. Next up, we have a comment from ELXABER, Elxaber, maybe. They said, what is the difference between a conspiracy theory and the truth? These days, it's a few months. That is pretty clever. Elxaber. You know what? You're kind of right. We never know what's true in this world nowadays.
It's hard to tell.
Yeah, but what we do know is that I've been your host, Hannah Thompson.
You know that? I've been your host, James, I think.
James is a little unsure. It's Fruity Dookies, man. You've got them all. Anyways, we'll see you in the next video.